Welcome to River City Church Online. Thank you for joining us today. It's our prayer that you're blessed by what you hear today, so let's go and join our pastor for this week's message.
My job today is simple. I get to introduce our guest speaker, but before I do, Sean triggered a memory that I thought I would share. He referenced our great neighborhood food drive last week, and the team that I went out with my wife Barb and others, received a note, and the person had the note on, I think they had 3 or 4 bags of groceries on their front step. And when we went up there, they actually came out of the house because they wanted to talk to us. But the note reads, "Thank you and your team for holding this annual food drive. You all make a big difference in our community. Bless you all." 8,500 pounds of food for a church of about 75 people works out to over 118 pounds of food per person. Wow. What a privilege to be used by God in this way, and what an honor that our neighbors trust our name and this tradition of going door to door. We go to the same 6,000 houses every year, and I don't know how it was for the rest of you, but in the neighborhood that I went in, I would say there were fewer houses that gave, but the ones that gave far more than on a typical year. So the generosity was really high among those who chose to participate, and I see some nods there as well. Also, I want to mention, usually on the first Sunday of the month, we have communion. And because we've got the volunteer training after the service today, so all of us who are on volunteer teams or in leadership, we're invited to stay behind after the coffee time to learn about how we can continue to be the safest church that we can, to look at our safe church policy, and to learn about what it requires to continue to be a volunteer at this church. So that's after the service, after our coffee time, to which everyone here is invited. And then I had to say that we'll be having communion then next Sunday, just because we've got a full day today, and we want to have something to celebrate every week. Also, next Sunday, we are launching a new series. And you hear me say this all the time probably, but I've never been more excited than for this coming series. I got a text from James Burmaster when he heard about the series. It is on the book of Ecclesiastes. I don't know how many of you have read it. Would you be bold and tell me, how many of you read Ecclesiastes cover to cover? Okay, so like 55%. It wasn't 50, it was 55. I want to challenge all of you this week in preparation for that 3-week series that we're doing to read Ecclesiastes. It's 12 chapters. Each chapter takes 5 minutes. That's like 1 hour. And you'll get much more out of this series. The series title is Finding Meaning When Everything Seems Meaningless. Finding meaning when everything seems meaningless. So this would be a great series to invite your neighbors and friends who aren't currently going to church but are struggling finding meaning to come for this series starting next week. So now I want to introduce Tom Jantzi, and Tom is with Shalem. I've been going to Shalem for many, many years, and I've been mispronouncing it the whole time. So thank you for correcting me, Tom. It's Shalem Mental Health Network, and because of the generosity of this congregation, we are now a CAP church, which means, actually I'm not going to tell you what it means because Tom will. So we are a CAP church. I couldn't be prouder and happier that we're a CAP church. Prior to becoming a psychotherapist, Tom was a pastor for 6 years. And he said he had the common sense to get out when he could. Actually, he didn't say that. But Tom, I want to welcome you forward, and can you give him a good River City welcome?
Thank you for that introduction, Daryl. It's true. I came out of Bible college, went right into pastoring, and realized, hold on a second, this is harder than I thought. So, blessings to you, Daryl, and all of the church leaders out here. Through that experience, I had a bit of a refining of my understanding of myself, my calling, and my gifts, and I moved towards working in mental health and am now a psychotherapist for Shalem. One of the best parts about working for Shalem is that you can pronounce our name any way you like. Yeah, that was for you. Yeah, it's a Hebrew word, same root as shalom, but shalem is a little bit off to the side from shalom, meaning whole peace. And that's kind of what drives us towards restoring hope towards whole peace in the lives of the people that we work with. I'm really excited to be here in Cambridge with you guys today. I came from Barrie. It's about a 2-hour drive, and in my ignorance, thinking we had snow yesterday, it was -5 when I got up this morning, I wore a wool sweater. So if you see me sweating up here, it's because it's warm. But I have not been to Cambridge probably in about 20 years. I grew up just west of Waterloo, just beyond, if you know, Wellesley, Millbank, that area over there. And I used to come to Cambridge once in a while when I was in my early teens, in the early 2000s. Can anyone guess why I would have came to Cambridge as a young teenage Christian in the early 2000s? I see some. Roller skating. Roller skating to DC talk. Has anyone ever done that before? I had totally forgotten about that until I was trying to think of the last time I was in Cambridge. Roller skating, and the other thing, there's one more thing. Fast Eddies. It was the best part. It was better than roller skating, in my opinion, was the Fast Eddies, when you're a 14-year-old growing boy and you can buy 5 burgers and not worry about it. I don't know if they're still as cheap, but I will definitely be hitting that up on my way home today. But it's good to be here. I'm here this morning, as Daryl said, because you as a church have committed to caring for each other and caring for each other's mental health by signing up for Shalem's counseling assistance plan. And I'll talk a little bit more about the details of that near the end of my talk today. But today, I want to, in light of that, I want to talk today, as you can see, the title of my sermon is The Elephant in the Pew, Acknowledging and Caring for Mental Health in the Church. And I use that title very specifically because sometimes mental health, especially in the context of church community, can feel a little bit like an elephant sitting next to us in the pew. And if you haven't heard that idiom before, it's referencing the common use is elephant in the room, something that's big, unavoidable, but no one wants to talk about. Another great line could have been the dirty diaper in the room. If you have kids, you know what that's like, avoiding talking and choosing to let your partner do the dirty diaper thing. But the elephant in the room is irrelevant in my experience in church and mental health because sometimes it can feel really uncomfortable to acknowledge our struggles, to acknowledge the challenge of mental health in the church. Sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming. Sometimes it can feel marginalizing and stigmatizing. Sometimes it can feel like we shouldn't struggle with our mental health as Christians. But what I want you can change the next slide. Sorry, I'll be giving hand motions for changing slides this morning. What I want you to walk away from today is to know that we must talk about mental health in the church because it affects every single one of us. It affects us all. It's very easily stigmatized and marginalized. And we're called as the church, as followers of Jesus, to care for the marginalized and the stigmatized in our community. Unfortunately, we don't have any explicit reference in the Bible of mental health. There's no Epistle of Tom 3:16 that says mental health is this and this is how you care for it. But we do have a lot of great examples in the scriptures of people, of human beings who lived through real human life and struggled in certain ways, in certain areas. One classic example are the prophets. I mean, a lot of the prophets. Elijah is one that comes to mind that struggled as they walked in their calling. Another one is David. You can see as he's running from Saul and hiding in caves and then writing Psalms, you can see it in the Psalms, how he struggled and he worked through and he wrestled with his mental health. We can even see Jesus, even as he knew what the end was going to be, even as he knew that he was going to raise his friend Lazarus from the dead, even in those moments, he wept. Shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept and he grieved. But today, as we talk about the elephant in the pew, I am most challenged and looking at the life of Job. Job is one of my favorite books of the Bible for many reasons. But when we look at the life of Job, we see a little glimpse of why it's important to talk about mental health in our church communities. And now Job, it's a poetic book. He's not talking about mental health directly, but we can see how it impacts his life. And the first point we see as we think about how mental health affects us all is that Job had everything going on for him. He was the epitome of privilege in his world. Job 1:1 tells us that he was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Verse 3 of that chapter says he was the greatest man among all the people of the East. And then he lost it all. He lost all of his children. He lost all of his wealth, his livestock, his servants. And his relationship with his wife was challenged. He lost his health. He experienced trauma. He experienced loss. He experienced depression, grief, broken relationships. Job struggled with his mental health in that moment. And what we can see here is that regardless of our privilege, regardless of our wealth, regardless of the depth of our faith and trust in God, we all can suffer. We all can experience mental health challenges. And you might be sitting here today thinking, well, those people don't suffer. The people on the other side of the room don't suffer because they've got it all figured out. They pray more than I do. They do this, they do that. Or you might think to yourself, I don't struggle with my mental health because I've got this, and this going on in my life. But the reality is it affects us all in one way or another. It's much like physical health. I can change to the next slide. It's on a continuum. When you think of mental health, what comes to mind? Are you guys comfortable shouting out? When you think of mental health, what comes to mind? Anxiety, sure. Depression, yeah. The pandemic, yeah. Just because we may struggle with our mental health does not mean necessarily that we have a mental illness. And I hope that's big enough on the slide there for you. It's kind of on a continuum. It's much like physical health in that, so a very recent personal example for myself. This is another sermon illustration for another sermon. But recently my wife earned a year's supply of Lay's potato chips. Since then, my physical health has not been as great. But I'm not ill. I don't have an illness. But my physical health maybe isn't as great. And it's the same thing with mental health and mental illness. They're not the same thing. You can experience anxiety, but not be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And so someone who has a mental illness can still have good mental health. If they're meeting with their doctor, if they're doing their care routines that are necessary for them, they can have good mental health and have a mental illness. On the other side of the spectrum, one can not have a mental illness, not be diagnosed with anything, and yet still really struggle with their mental health, have poor mental health. And so I say that to kind of demystify a little bit that, I don't have a mental illness, I'm not diagnosed, or to say, I have a mental illness, I am diagnosed, I'm over here on this spectrum. It goes as our life goes. Sometimes it'll be good, sometimes it'll be hard, sometimes it'll be easy, sometimes we'll feel really healthy, and sometimes we won't. But it affects us all. Another way that mental health is kind of like the elephant in the pew, per se, is that, you can change to the next slide. Sorry, I forgot I wasn't controlling that. Is that the mental health experience for each of us can be very, very different. For Job, we can see he sat and he wept. He scraped his skin because of the boils. He sat and he wrestled with God and he spoke with God. And for some people, it is rooted in feeling down and depressed and sad. For other people, it's experiencing anxiety and anxious and trembling and physical implications and all those kinds of things. But it can affect us all in different ways. And sometimes the temptation might be say, that person doesn't have mental health challenges because they're always smiling. Or that person doesn't know what I experience because I experience depression in this way or that way. But there's a common story in a bunch of different South Asian and East Asian cultures that have elephants in them about 7 blind men who are asked to describe an elephant. Have any of you heard that story before? These 7 blind men are asked to describe an elephant, and the one holding the trunk says it feels kind of like a snake. The one holding the tail says it feels kind of like a whip. An elephant is like a whip. The one touching the legs says an elephant is kind of like a tree. They all were touching the elephant, but experiencing it in very different ways. And that story is often used to describe, in those cultures, to describe how we all have different perspectives on things. And the same is true for mental health. We all can experience it in very different ways. But that doesn't mean that just because I experience mental health challenges like an elephant trunk and you experience mental health challenges like a tail, it doesn't mean that those challenges are any less or more painful, challenging, hope-filled than the other. Examples: depression can feel like little interest or pleasure in doing things. It can feel like trouble falling asleep or sleeping too much, having no appetite or eating too much. It can feel like feeling bad about yourself, that you're a failure, have let yourself, your family down. On the flip side, anxiety can feel like trouble relaxing, being restless, that it's hard to stand still, becoming easily annoyed or irritable. Someone mentioned earlier the pandemic. Mental health affects us all. And we see that in the pandemic research coming out of that in early 2023, the Angus Reid Institute found that 1 in 3 of Canadians say that they're struggling with their mental health. Even as you're sitting here thinking, oh, I'm struggling so much, but no one else is, know that 1 in 3 Canadians are struggling as well, that you're not alone. Similarly, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Canada found that 1 in 5 adults reported a mental health problem, and 100% of Canadians are indirectly affected because of friends and family. We need to talk about mental health in the church community because it affects us all. Even if you're having the best day of your life right now, it's very likely that there's someone next to you, someone in proximity to you at home, at work, on the bus, that is struggling with their mental health as well. And for that reason, we need to be talking about the elephant in the pew, mental health in church community. The other reason that we need to talk about mental health is that it's easily stigmatized and marginalized. Just like an elephant sitting in a pew, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel like it takes up a lot of space. It can be embarrassing. It can be personal. It can be really vulnerable. Everyone else doesn't seem to experience what I'm experiencing. It can be scary. What happened next? It can cause damage to our relationships. Maybe they'll think of me differently if they know how I really feel right now. And we see this in in the book of Job, in Job's experience. We see some marginalization and some stigmatization of Job's experience by his friends. If you know that story, his friends show up, and they're not overly helpful. They try to care, they try to fix his problem. They try to tell him what he did wrong. They blame him, saying he had done something to offend God. They believed that God, and they told Job this, that God punishes the wicked and only does good for the righteous. So it must be that you did something wrong to offend God. They did not empathize with him. They told Job that it was karma, so he needs to fix his relationship with God. But karma is not a part of the good news of Jesus. It is not compatible with the grace of God. He's given us so much that for simply the fact that he loves us so much, not based on what we've done, how good we feel, how good we do. Therefore, the problem with Job's friends is that they were connecting his mental health, his physical health, his circumstances of loss to his spirituality and his faith and his trust in God. And that can easily happen by accident or on purpose in the church context as we talk about following Jesus. But I want to challenge you to consider the fact that the idea that our mental health is not exclusively tied to our spiritual health. You can switch to the next slide. These are some of the myths that I hear in the counseling room and that I hear in conversation with different churches related to mental health. And maybe you've thought this before, maybe you've been told this before. The first one being that if you struggle with your mental health, you have a lack of faith. Another one, you might have unresolved sin. That's why you're struggling with mental health. That feeling despair is a failure of faith in God's goodness. That laziness is a sin if you can't get up out of bed, if you're struggling to get out of bed in the morning. And that if you struggle with your mental health, that you're unfit to serve the Lord in certain ways. But the truth is, as we find through science and as we walk in mental health challenges and see freedom, that mental health is affected a lot by our physical bodies. There are physical symptoms to mental health that are physically related. Our mental health can be impacted by harm and trauma done by other people, things that are completely out of our control. We know and we see increasingly with functional magnetic resonance imaging and studies that emotions are healthy indicators. It's very cool, this is a total tangent, but they're doing fMRI scans of people's brains as they experience emotions and seeing what happens in the brain when that happens. Emotions are healthy indicators to us of what's going on in our life, what's going on that we're receiving in from the world around us. We also know that energy requires health. Sometimes when it's hard to get up in the morning, it's a lot easier when you're healthy. Also when the sun's come up. There are other factors that relate to our struggles for energy in life. And then struggles with mental health, they also help us to empathize with those in pain. It's important to acknowledge and wrestle with and talk through these myths and truths about mental health in our church community as a way to break down those barriers, to start to proactively challenge the stigma and the marginalization that come when we start to feel like, I'm not like everyone else. When we start to wonder, I don't belong because of what I'm experiencing right now. Next slide. Another way that we see mental health being stigmatized and marginalized in the church community is by something called spiritual bypassing. Has anyone heard that term before? Spiritual bypassing is when we use faith in Scripture to avoid and escape our problems, rather than as a resource to engage and grow through them. And it's something that's really easy to do to ourselves and to those that we love around us. Job's friends are a great example. They were very well-meaning. They wanted to help Job. They wanted to solve his problems. Just confess what you did wrong and God will fix everything, they said. They wanted to, but what they were doing, they were using their understanding of God as a way to avoid and try and fix and surpass all of the challenges that he was facing, the pain that he was experiencing. It can happen personally as well. When we sit in our pain, when we experience difficulty, and we say, I'm so scared, I'm worried, but God is good. When we say, I have this fear, but I trust that God is faithful, we're using spiritual bypassing by saying, it's not okay. God is faithful. It's not okay that I feel afraid. The alternate would be to say, I feel afraid and God is faithful. When we say but, we invalidate the first side. We invalidate the fear when we say, I can't feel fear because God is faithful. But when we use the word and, we hold space for those two things to be true at the same time. I feel afraid and God is faithful. It's okay to feel afraid. It's okay to struggle with our mental health. And at the same time that we struggle with our mental health, God is still good. God is still faithful. God is still gracious. God is still kind. Your worship songs this morning were so appropriate. And one of my favorite things about going to different churches is getting to hear the different music, the different songs that everyone sings. And such great examples of declaring the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God. I think the one song said, I'm not going to fear because I see the evidence. Anyone who's ever experienced cognitive behavioral therapy, that's exactly what we do in cognitive behavioral therapy. We look at the evidence to challenge those fears. The danger is when we put that but in the middle and we say, this evidence tells me I can't feel fear. This evidence tells me that I'm not allowed to struggle with my mental health. But when we put the and in there, when we see that though both those things can be true, I can feel fear, I can feel sadness, I can feel worry, I can feel anxious, and God is faithful, God is true, God is good, God is kind, God is my provider, God is my healer. Both those things can be true, and we can find God. He meets us in the middle. Another classic verse that sometimes can be used in spiritual bypassing is James 1, 2-4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. That's true. That's such an encouraging verse from James. And we need to be careful that when we quote that verse, when we lean on that truth to lift ourselves up, to lift each other up, that we don't do it in a way that invalidates, that we don't use the but, that we use the and, that we don't invalidate the very real, painful mental health experiences that we may be facing. Next slide. Along that line with spiritual bypassing is also the reality that mental health has a lot of physical causes, has a lot of social causes, it has a lot of biological causes, psychological causes. This is a picture of the brain, and I am not a brain scientist, so I won't try and explain too much of what happens there. But a great example is, you can't read that, that's too small, but there's a little part there called the amygdala, which helps us to regulate our anxiety in moments of stress and reaction. And sometimes that can go a little haywire. We get into rhythms and patterns of reacting in certain ways that serve us in certain situations, but not in other situations. And that's how sometimes we can develop these mental health challenges. But has anyone in here ever thought about their amygdala before today? Yeah, those of us who've been in therapy maybe, because our therapist told us about it. But the reality is we're not thinking that in the moment. What we're thinking of and what we're challenged by is like, oh God, why aren't you helping me? Why is this happening right now? What we're telling to each other and our friends and ourselves is pull up your bootstraps, figure it out, be stronger, work harder, get up earlier, pray faster, whatever it is. But the reality is that there are very real social, psychological, and biological impacts that affect our mental health. Another aspect is with neurotransmitters in our brain. You may have heard this before. That depression and anxiety is often impacted by the levels of serotonin, epinephrine, all the other chemicals in there that are in our brain. And so that's where sometimes medications can come along and be prescribed by doctors to help us to get out of that experience of depression. The final point, the third point, we must talk about mental health in church because we are called to care for the marginalized and the stigmatized. I don't know if you know this about elephants, but they require very special care. I've never cared for an elephant myself, but there's a really interesting case study. Has someone in here cared for an elephant? Beautiful. Do you know about the Toronto Zoo? The Toronto Zoo? Oh, yeah. Yeah, marvelous. They require special care. In 2013, there was this big kerfuffle around the Toronto Zoo because they had all these elephants, and they had a pack of elephants, and they were starting to die and get really sick. And so through that, they had to look at what is our mission here? Because their mission, their tagline at the Toronto Zoo is Guardians of the Wild. And there was a time in history where they thought, you know what, the best way to care for these elephants is to educate people, have them here in the Toronto Zoo, in an urban zoo, to help preserve the elephants. But what they found in 2013 was they were dying off in that context. And so they had to make an adjustment. They had to make a shift. They had to put in a very big investment to do what was best for those elephants, and they moved them from Toronto to California to an elephant sanctuary to live and breathe and be healthy again. They require special care. Similarly, mental health challenges in the church require special care. It can be easy even accidental sometimes, to marginalize and stigmatize mental health in our church communities, as we've just discussed. But it's important that we talk about it because we're called as followers of Jesus to, in the next slide, to care for the marginalized and the stigmatized in our world. Matthew 22, 37 to 39, the Pharisees are trying to corner Jesus, and they're saying, hey, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. As followers of Jesus, we're called to love our neighbors and follow Jesus' example. We're called to follow Jesus' example. Jesus engaged with and healed lepers who were marginalized due to their illness. And not just, ooh, gross, they were separated from their community, and Jesus touched them when he healed them. He spoke with the woman at the well in John 4. That woman was stigmatized and marginalized due to her religion and her life circumstances, the location she lived, so many factors. Jesus sat with the woman who was caught in adultery and did not condemn her in John chapter 8. We have the example of Jesus, and we have the example of Christians, of our forefathers, of our role models in the faith throughout the last 2,000 plus years, who've cared for issues of poverty, who've cared for issues of housing, who've cared for addictions and illness, even when it wasn't in vogue, even when it was at great cost. We have this calling as followers of Jesus to care for the marginalized and the stigmatized. On the next slide, you'll see a painting that I've come to really appreciate. Does anyone recognize this painting and who the painter is? This is my favorite Picasso. He painted this when he was 19 years old in 1897, and it's titled Science and Charity. On the one side, I could stare at this painting for hours because there's so much to see. Because on the one side, we have the medical professional taking the pulse, looking at his watch. And on the other side, we have, I'm assuming, maybe a nun who's holding the child and passing a cup of tea. What I love most about this is that it shows the need, the necessity, the role of both sides in this endeavor. That there is the need for the professional, there is the need for science and medical professionals to support, but then there's also the need for the church. There's the need for the human connection. There's the need for the human care in the midst of that. And we as a church community have such, not just a calling and a responsibility and a history, but we have such an opportunity to have an impact on the mental health of our communities. There is research and growing research. You can go to the next slide. This might be a bit small for you guys to see, but there's growing research that the research uses the language spirituality and religion as impact on mental health, on mental health symptoms and experiences. And what the research finds is that for depression, people who are engaged in spirituality and religious things are generally higher levels of SR, that's spirituality and religion, are generally associated with lower depressive symptoms. For anxiety, there are mixed findings with both positive and negative relationships. For suicide, higher levels of spirituality and religion are generally associated with lower suicidality. For substance use disorder, higher levels of spirituality and religion are generally associated with lower substance use. Psychotic disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorders, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorder, these are all being researched and found to have some very minor or sometimes higher impacts on these mental illnesses and the mental health challenges that surround them, based on people's connection to spirituality and religion. We have an opportunity as a church to walk in that data, to be an impact on that reality for so many people. Next slide. The question then is, so what? So what? Well, let's talk about mental health. It's about as simple as that. Let's talk. And that can feel complicated. If you're struggling in your mental health, that can feel complicated to talk about your mental health because of what we talked about before. The elephant is vulnerable, it's personal, it's scary. And so the onus, the challenge then is for those of us who maybe today you're feeling okay. Maybe today you're feeling your mental health is maybe higher up on that continuum chart that we looked at. It's important that we hold space for our friends and our family and our coworkers who might be struggling. It's important that we listen with grace, that we listen with empathy. We're not here to fix problems. We're here to care and sit with and empathize. We see this actually, Job's friends. The one thing they did well was that when they first showed up, they sat with him in silence for 7 days. And this is a Hebrew practice, a Jewish practice of Shiva. It's related to grieving processes and all that kind of thing. But we can learn from that to sit with each other. Sometimes in silence is a good thing. To allow space to feel, to validate that human experience, using the and instead of the but. The other thing we can do is ask for help. And I know, personally and professionally, I know that can be so hard. And that's where, again, it's important to offer help. One of the most common things that is said in my office when I'm working as a psychotherapist, when people come in from whatever challenges they're facing, and they've had some sort of a big experience that led them to come to therapy. Maybe they had an anger outburst that wasn't healthy. Maybe they spent a season locked away and shut away from the world because of their pain and their struggles with mental health. One of the most common things they say is that when I asked people for help, when I showed them how much I was struggling, they said, I'm surprised this didn't happen sooner. I'm surprised you didn't blow up sooner. I'm surprised you didn't go to the hospital sooner. And the pain that my clients express in that moment of wishing that someone would have offered to listen, of wishing that if you saw and you're surprised it didn't happen sooner, why didn't you sit with me? Why didn't you ask, how are you really doing? Why didn't you offer me that space to sit and to belong with you? And so my challenge, not just to ask for help, but to offer help. And finally, to hold on to and believe and trust in God's faithfulness and God's goodness, that it's okay not to be okay. It doesn't mean you're a bad Christian if you struggle with your mental health. It doesn't mean you're a weak person if you struggle with your mental health. It's okay to not be okay. And God is still with you. In more practical terms, you can switch to the next slide. At Shalem, we have a couple of partners that are really great resources. If you've ever heard of Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries, they're an online organization. They have a ton of free resources, including an 8-week alpha-type course that talks about like theology and mental health and how to support each other and how to walk as a church through caring for mental health. There's also an organization called Hope Made Strong. They have a free podcast which is really good, and they also do workshops and trainings for how to build up a care ministry within your church among your volunteers. There are moments where you will need to reach out. There are moments where you'll need to ask for help from professionals. It looks a little bit small there, so I'll read it off. If you notice that your mental health challenges are lasting for a long time, weeks or months without relief, it might be time to talk to a professional. If you notice that your symptoms are severe and having noticeable impacts on your functioning, your general functioning, or on your relationships, then it might be time to talk to a professional. If you're feeling stuck, your individual efforts, or maybe caring for a friend or a family member, and everything that you've tried to do has not seemed to make a difference, then it might be time to talk to a professional. If you have thoughts of suicide, if you have any indication of psychosis, whether it's hallucinations, delusions, or disorganized thinking, or if there's any presence of threats or acts of violence, those are moments where it's time to talk to a professional. And some of those professional resources, in case you've never heard of them before, one of them is 988. It's just like 911, except different, and it's for Suicide Crisis Helpline. If you ever are experiencing thoughts of harm to yourself or to others, or if you're supporting someone and you feel stuck and don't know how to support them and you're in a moment, you can call them anytime, 24/7. They're there to talk with you. They're there to share resources with you. They're there to help you. 24/7, confidential. Another one is Connects Ontario. It's a website that has a lot of different community resources related to mental health. And then ultimately, the next slide, the reason I'm here is the CAP program, which I'm so very proud of. Shalem has been offering this program for over 18 years now, a little over 18 years, to churches throughout southwestern Ontario. We're expanding to Nova Scotia and British Columbia. And what this is it's a program that your church has paid for, where the church has paid. You do not have to pay. It's free for you. If you are in a moment where you need to talk to a professional, where you want to talk to a professional, maybe you're not comfortable sharing with the people next to you yet. Maybe you're just feeling too overwhelmed and stuck and don't know where to go. You can call us at those numbers. You can scan the QR code. You can email us. You can text us. And we will set you up with a counselor, online or in person. We'll set you up with a counselor where you can have 6 free counseling sessions that the church has paid for, with a professional counselor who's also a Christian, who also gets it when it comes to navigating this as a follower of Jesus, navigating that temptation to invalidate our emotions and our experience because we trust God. Professional Christian psychotherapists, 6 sessions. Finally, if we go to the next slide, in summary, my hope is that you just talk to each other, talk as a group about mental health. Have that conversation, acknowledge the elephant in the room, because that's the only way that the elephant will experience care. Jesus said, I have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly. And my hope is that through the CAP program and through talking about mental health in your church community, that you will experience that abundant life that Jesus offers for us. I'm going to close today with a prayer, and then I'll pass it back to you, Daryl, if that's all right. But I just want to bless you. I'm so excited. Every time a church calls to say, hey, we want to do this, I know it's not cheap. It's not a simple thing. But that your church has decided and wanted to allocate resources and prioritize caring for your mental health is such a huge deal. So, Father, I just pray a blessing over River City Church. I thank you for their hope in you, for their work in this community. And Lord, I pray that you would bless them with peace. Lord, that you would bless them with courage and confidence to talk about mental health in their community, to talk with each other, to open up, to ask, how are you really doing? To say, this is how I'm really doing. To be the hands and feet that you have called us to be, to care for the marginalized and the stigmatized in Cambridge. Thank you for the work they're doing, and thank you for your faithfulness to them. Amen.
Thanks for checking us out today. We hope that you will join us here on YouTube or in person next week to continue our study of God's Word. If you have questions about your faith, please go to our website, rivercitychurch.org, and click on the Contact Us tab. We would love to hear from you and learn how we can serve you better. We exist in this community because of generous support from donors like you. If you would like to support this ministry because you were blessed by what you heard today, please go to our website, rivercitychurch.org, and click on the Giving tab. There'll be all kinds of options there for you where you can give to support our ministry in Cambridge, Ontario. Have a great week. I hope that God surprises you with his love today and every day. Thanks for watching.